now it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and most importantly the president of Hillsdale College, Dr. Larry Arnn. Dr. Arnn received his BA in 1974 from Arkansas State University. We learned last night that he may have had a dog bite when he received his degree, but he went on to graduate with the highest distinction. He also received his MA in government in 1976 and his PhD in government in 1985 from Claremont Graduate School. Dr. Arnn has numerous accomplishments. Those include his service as research director of the official biographer of Winston Churchill, Sir Martin Gilbert, and president of the Claremont Institute. He has served on numerous governing boards, including the Heritage Foundation, the Claremont Institute, and the Army War College Board of Visitors. Since coming to Hillsdale College in 2000, the college has grown to national prominence through its outstanding academic programs and principled defense of our Constitution. Dr. Arnn is married to his lovely wife, Penny, and they have 4 children, Katie, Henry, Alice, and Tony. Please welcome Dr. Arnn.
Thank you most warmly, Chris. Chris hadn't mentioned it because he makes Republicans mad all the time, but he's the head of the Club for Growth. And in that, he does really great work, and that's what makes Republicans mad. And one piece of great work he's done happens to be an old friend of mine, who's, I guess I've known him since well before he was born. And he's running for Congress, and he's going to get elected. He's in a seat down in Arkansas where he's going to win. And, of course, I'm from Arkansas, and that means that this man and I are cousins. And that means he's a candidate to marry my sister or something. But because isn't this awful? I'm getting ready to introduce a New Yorker, by the way, and he's thinking right now, what is this? And everything about this guy is incredibly weird. He's a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School. I've known him since he was in the law school. And a few years ago, I got a letter from him, and he said he wanted me to write to the Army for him because he decided he wanted to go serve his country, and they wanted to put him in the Judge Advocates General branch. He's a fancy lawyer, but no, he wanted to fight. And so I wrote a letter to him and said that, look, you got to put this guy in the trenches because he wants to get shot. And if he doesn't get shot, he'll end up being some good for the country. So it's an excellent investment. What does it cost you if he does get shot? And he patrolled the streets of Fallujah, and he was in the old guard, guarding the tomb of the unknown soldier. And I can't stop. He's a really great guy. His name's Tom Cotton. Please stand up. And when he gets into Congress, and he does some stupid thing, then write me, and I will take care of it. Because I thank you all for being here most warmly. I hope you saw this morning we had some good fights, and it was they're the kind that can lead to the truth, and so we're getting somewhere. And I hope you saw Charles Kessler's presentation at lunch today, because it ties into the introduction I have to make tonight. He said that modern liberalism or progressivism, which is in the course of transforming our country, for good or for ill, but certainly very dramatically, has proceeded in these 3 waves, and now Obama is the 4th. And he says that the New Freedom under Woodrow Wilson and the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt and the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson were the first 3 waves. And he said it's peculiar about them that they stopped for a long hiatus after each one of them made what they call progress, changed things a lot. And then the next one more, and the next one more, and then there was a pause. it raises the interesting question, how would you make something more than a pause? Are we on this ratchet that we like to talk about sometime? Or is there the kind of progress possible that would come after there was a return? And there hasn't really been any experience of return, at least not fully. But there have been these pauses, and it's possible the way back towards some return could be found in how the pauses were achieved. And I believe that, myself, that every great and stable thing that happens in politics, any long-term durability of good in politics, always comes from the combination of two forces. I think I have learned this from Winston Churchill. I think this is how he looked at the world. I think one of those forces is constitutionalism. Constitutionalism is a form for government. It gives it stability. It gives patterns through which it works. It shapes how people work in it, and therefore it affects their characters, and a good constitution elevates those characters. And the other force is an opposite kind of force. If constitutionalism has to do with procedures and stable going along and checking the will of people at any given moment because they must act, if they're going to act effectively, in a certain way and not just at that moment necessarily the way they want to act, the other force is opposite to constitutionalism then. It's statesmanship. It's what highly effective and driven people do when they're good at details and they can make things happen. Adolf Hitler learned to his cost that it was a mistake to get into a war with Winston Churchill. It cost him his life. Winston Churchill was a lethal man. And if you knew what he was like when he was a boy, 3 times decorated in war by the time he was 26, and then immediately the author of best-selling books about the war that became the chief way that anybody in his country knew about the war and shaped what they thought. And Churchill was a second lieutenant, which means the generals were really cranky about that. There's something about that guy that just could not be stopped. And he was always like that. He was captured once and marched through the rain at gunpoint and went for a day and a half on a train and got to the capital of prisoner of war of South Africa, Pretoria, and they happened to take a picture of him alongside a bunch of other soldiers. And all the rest of them had their heads down and they were drooping. And there was this one guy, and he didn't know his picture was being taken, but he was standing off at the side and he was looking at them with contempt, and his chin was up just like that. And the point is, you want to get in a war like that, fear that man. He will kill you. The greatest of such men are always supporters of constitutionalism. George Washington was such a man. Cross the Delaware River on Christmas night and wake up a bunch of enemy soldiers and try to kill them in their beds after their Christmas revels in order to get some kind of victory to hang on for a few more months. Ruthlessness, but always coupled with restraint in the great ones. And that twin combination is simply essential. And if we look back through these 3 pauses, because there's no pause yet in the 4th of the waves of liberalism, we look back to 2 things that have produced at least the pauses and might in principle produce the return. And one of them is the obvious operation of the Constitution of the United States. It takes time to get anything done under it. And liberalism gets these spurts, but they get checked because you can't do it all at once. And the other is statesmanship. What statesman can we find if we look back through this history of America when it has been changed so much? Obviously, the name of Ronald Reagan comes up. It's encouraging to think about that name because he was behind in the middle of September in 1980. I'm not making any particular topical reference there. But you would also have to include our speaker tonight. His story is the story of these years in the second 2 waves. He's a graduate of Columbia, of Cambridge, of the Jewish Theological Seminary. He's won many awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He's authored 12 books. They're all worth reading. I've read about half of them. He served his country in the Army from 1953 to 55. He was editor-at-large of Commentary magazine and then promoted editor-in-chief, which job he proceeded to do for 35 years. During that time, Commentary magazine became a force to stop the advance of communism and the advance of liberalism in our country, and it had not been that before the day he became its editor. In the 1970s, he founded the Committee on the Present Danger, and that was just about the time when Leonid Brezhnev gave an illegal speech in Berlin, violation of several treaties, the Correlation of Forces speech, and he stopped in the middle of the speech, and MiG jets flew over to emphasize, and that's what was illegal, flew over to emphasize the point of the speech, which is the correlation of forces has shifted in our favor, and now the world is going to begin to conform to our will. That's what he had to say. And it's at that time and those series of events in the administration of James Carter, which is also the administration that started its assault upon our college back in the same years, that led to formation of this little committee. Here's the time for me to say that this man is married to one of my favorite people. I have known her for getting on 30 years now and adore her and think that she is tougher than her husband. And when I'm done describing her husband, you'll know that that's very tough indeed. Her name is Midge Decter. Their lives are a conversion story of a kind, but I've always thought from coming to know them that the love of decency and freedom that is native to them, it didn't really amount to a conversion. They just got instructed about some stuff that they hadn't understood when they were younger. He did one of the most fine and defiant things I know, because I can remember in 1982 when he published an article I'm about to quote from. My teacher, Harry Jaffa, who adores Norman. He's one of those few men that Jaffa would talk to his students about, always, of course, to point out, alongside Milton Friedman, another one, that, of course, Professor Jaffa is much smarter and more right than these guys. But these guys are really great. You got to know Professor Jaffa, but if you do know him, you'll know that that's exactly what he's like. And he came, one time he came, and I was working at the Claremont Institute in those days. I wasn't the president of it yet. And he sat me down, and he read me most of a long article in Commentary magazine called J'accuse. The name comes from a famous article by Émile Zola in France in 1898. He was a staunch defender, Zola was, of the French Republic at that time, and a kind of figure of French establishment. And this man, an officer by the name of Dreyfus, was accused of treason and prosecuted. And Zola was sure that this was wrong. And so he went on the line to accuse the French government broadly of anti-Semitism, which led eventually to the rescue and the freedom of the reputation and the liberation from prison of Dreyfus. His article doesn't accuse the United States exactly, but the West itself, because this is at a time when Israel, and such a time, by the way, have you read the newspapers lately, is about us right now, when it's in mortal peril, and that peril has become more acute than the regular acuteness that they live under all the time. And you have to know about that place, by the way, that is a tiny little place. If you're any good at all, you can ride a bicycle the length of it in a day, and you can trot the width of it in a day. That's what the size of it is. And so there isn't any room. And since I'm on about it, I will tell you, because I happen to know a lot about this because I used to work for Martin Gilbert, that the same set of promises were made in the First World War, that if the Ottoman Empire should go away, that some Jews would be given a country and there'd be some Arab countries. And the service they had to do was to fight against the Ottomans alongside the Western Allies. And the Arabs got many countries out of this, and the Jews got one. And the one that they got, and I'm mentioning this for a reason because it comes up a lot lately, and nobody knows the basic facts, and yet they're terribly simple. And there were many plans about what the size of the Jewish country should be. And the plan that was finally selected was the smallest of all of the possible plans. And in fact, the place that was selected is objectively, or in absolute terms, simply tiny. And so it's difficult to think in what corner of the world could they be placed in their escape from the Holocaust and their hope to be protected in it later, except in that pitiful little bitty place. That's what they've been given, and they're not been given anymore. This article contains a quote, and it goes way beyond the issue of Israel, which I'm going to leave now, and I'm going to talk about something that involves every one of us, every living human being. For as long, by the way, as recorded history exists. Hostility, writes our speaker tonight, toward Israel is a sure sign of the failing faith in and support for the virtues and values of Western civilization in general and of America in particular. And this reminds me of something that Winston Churchill wrote that's also terribly like something the great political philosopher Leo Strauss wrote. I have to tell you the joke that's at the beginning of this paragraph because Churchill liked the Jews a lot and he knew them very well. And the paragraph begins, "It has been well said that wherever there are 3 Jews, it will be found that there are 2 prime ministers and 1 leader of the opposition." They are, as God said, a stiff-necked people. Churchill continues later in the paragraph, "No 2 cities have counted more with mankind than Athens and Jerusalem. Their messages in religion, philosophy, and art have been the main guiding lights of modern faith and culture. Centuries of foreign rule and indescribable endless oppression leave them still living, active communities and forces in the modern world, quarreling, of course, among themselves with insatiable vivacity. Personally," Churchill writes, "I have always been on the side of both and believed in their invincible power to survive internal strife and the world tides threatening their extinction. What's at stake, is the wish of people to live in a society that is oriented upwards toward the best things, in freedom and peace and culture and learning and art and civility. The West has produced that because of the teachings that come from those 2 cities. And when we forget that, we forget ourselves, and we stand the chance of losing what is best in ourselves." And the man that I introduced you to you now is like Winston Churchill, a constitutionalist who is also a statesman, which is a synonym, remember always, for a warrior. Norman Podhoretz.
I'm an octogenarian, you have to forgive me. That was quite an introduction. I love flattering introductions, though I must say this is about the most flattering I've ever been subjected to. And one of the reasons I love flattering introductions is not just because they tickle my vanity, but also because they give me an opportunity to segue smoothly into the telling of one of my favorite jokes, which is, of course, a Jewish joke. It takes place in an unusual venue, which is a deathbed of an ancient rabbi who is surrounded by his disciples and students who are weeping and wailing and tearing their clothes at the imminent demise of their rabbi. And one of them says, "Oh, how will we survive the death of our rabbi?" He is the most learned man of the age, and who will be there to teach us when he is gone? And a second said, how will we survive the death of our rabbi? He is the most moral man of the age, and who will set us an example of ethical conduct when he is gone? And the third said, how will we survive the death of our rabbi? He's the wisest man of the age, and who will show us the path of wisdom when he is gone? And they weep and they wail, and the old man, with the last ounce of strength in his failing body, lifts himself up in his elbow and says, and about my humility you have nothing to say? Well, I regret to notice that Larry had nothing to say about my humility. But I'll have to suffer that gracefully. I was asked and delighted to respond to speak tonight on the subject of Is America Exceptional?, which is what I am about to do. Once upon a time, hardly anyone dissented from the idea that, for better or worse, the United States of America was different from all other nations. This isn't surprising, since the attributes that made it different were vividly evident from the day of its birth. Perhaps the most detailed and the deepest analysis of these attributes can be found in Larry Arnn's beautiful book, The Founder's Key. But let me say a few words about three of them in particular. First of all, unlike all other nations, past or present, this one accepted as self-evident truth that all men were created equal. Now, what this meant was that the founders aimed to create a society in which, for the first time in the history of the world, the individual's fate would be determined not by who his father was, but by his own freely chosen pursuit of his own ambitions. In other words, America was to be something entirely new under the sun, a society in which hereditary status and class distinctions would be erased, leaving individuals free to act and to be judged on their own merits alone. Now, there remained, of course, the two atavistic contradictions of slavery and the position of women. But so intolerable did they ultimately prove that they had to be resolved, even though, in the case of one of them, if it took fighting the bloodiest war the nation had and still has ever fought. Secondly, in all other countries, membership or citizenship was a matter of birth, of blood, of lineage, of rootedness in the soil. From this it followed that foreigners who might have been admitted for one reason or another could never become full-fledged members of the society. But America was the incarnation of an idea, and therefore no such factors came into play. To become a full-fledged American, neither birth nor lineage was required. It was only necessary to pledge allegiance to the new republic and to the principles for which it stood. Thirdly, in all other nations, the rights, if any, enjoyed by their citizens were conferred by human agencies, kings and princes, and occasionally parliaments. As such, these rights amounted to privileges and therefore could be revoked at will by the same human agencies. In America, by sharp contrast, the citizens' rights were declared from the very beginning to have come from God and to be inalienable, that is, immune to legitimate revocation or cancellation or qualification by any human agency. As I say, these and all the other ways in which America was exceptional were obvious to just about everyone from the beginning. Now, to be sure, there have always been sporadic efforts to change or reverse the revolutionary course to which the signers of the Declaration of Independence pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, and to whose lofty Jeffersonian words the Constitution later gave Madisonian flesh. The most influential of these counter-revolutionary efforts was and is the progressive movement, whose development from Woodrow Wilson to Barack Obama is brilliantly traced, as Larry has mentioned, in Charles Kessler's new book, I Am the Change. Nevertheless, and in defiance of such currents, the course mapped out by the founders has, in principle at least, remained the mandatory national direction to this very day. A good contemporary case in point was affirmative action. By resurrecting the hereditary considerations explicitly repudiated by the Declaration, and then updating them with race and gender replacing blood and lineage, affirmative action flew in the face of perhaps the most revolutionary of the ideas on which the American Republic was founded. Yet, so powerful a hold did this idea retain on the American mind that the proponents of affirmative action were forced to pretend that it was somehow faithful to the principle of individual merit. Be that as it may, as time went on, other characteristics that were unique to America gradually manifested themselves. For instance, in the 20th century, social scientists began speculating on why America was the only country in the developed world where socialism had failed to take root. As it happens, I myself first came upon the term American exceptionalism, not in Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, where it has mistakenly been thought to have originated, but in a book by the sociologist Seymour Martin Lipset, who used it in connection with the absence in America of a strong socialist party. More recently, I've discovered that it may actually have been Joseph Stalin, of all people, who coined the term in the same connection, but that he did so only to dismiss it. Thus, when an American communist leader informed him that American workers had no intention of playing the role Marx had assigned to the worldwide proletariat as the vanguard of the coming socialist revolution, Stalin reputedly shouted something like, "Away with this heresy of American exceptionalism." And yet Stalin and his followers were themselves exceptional in denying that America was exceptional in the plainly observable sense of being different in many respects from all the other nations in the world. If, however, almost everyone agreed that America was different, there was a great deal of disagreement over the question of whether this exceptionalism made it into a force for good or a force for evil. This too went back to the beginning, when the denigrators far outnumbered the enthusiasts. At first, anti-American passions were understandably fueled by the dangerous political challenge posed to the monarchies of Europe by the democratic, or more precisely, the republican ideas of the American Revolution. But the political side of anti-Americanism was soon joined to a cultural indictment that proved to have more staying power. So much more that in one form or another it has persisted up to this very moment. Here's how the volatile but brilliant historian Henry Adams, the descendant of two American presidents, John Adams was his great-grandfather and John Quincy Adams his grandfather, here's how Henry Adams once described the cultural indictment as it was framed in the earliest days of the Republic. In the foreigner's range of observation, Adams wrote, love of money was the most conspicuous and the most common trait of the American character. No foreigner of that day, neither poet, painter, or philosopher, could detect in American life anything higher than vulgarity. Englishmen especially indulge in unbounded invective against the sordid character of American society. Contemporary critics could see neither generosity, economy, honor, nor ideas of any kind in the American breast. Well, in his younger days, Henry Adams defended the America of 1800 against these foreign critics, but he himself, snobbishly recoiling from the changes wrought by the rapid industrialization of the country following the Civil War, would later hurl the very same charge at the America of the so-called Gilded Age. And we see a similar conflict in Tocqueville, writing about the America of 1830. His great book, Democracy in America, was mainly a defense of the country's political system and many of its egalitarian habits and mores. But where its cultural and spiritual life was concerned, Tocqueville expressed much the same contempt as the critics cited by Henry Adams. The Americans, he wrote, with their exclusively commercial habits, were so fixated upon purely practical objects that they neglected the pursuit of science, literature, and the arts. And it was only their proximity to Europe that allowed them to neglect these pursuits without lapsing into barbarism. Well, many years later, another Frenchman, Georges Clemenceau, went Tocqueville one better in denigrating the cultural side of American exceptionalism. America, he quipped, is the only nation in history which miraculously has gone from barbarism to decadence without the usual interval of civilization. The French should talk. The main reason for the enduring power of the cultural critique was its fervent embrace, beginning in the Gilded Age, by the vast majority of the writers, artists, and intellectuals who followed Tocqueville and his predecessors in lamenting the indifference and even hostility to things of the spirit on the part of American society at large. And so it still goes in 2012, when, in various versions, the putative materialism and crassness of American life are harped upon in movies, television shows, novels, volumes of social criticism, and op-ed pieces too numerous to count. Like Tocqueville and the foreigners cited by Henry Adams, moreover, such works attribute this crassly Philistine attitude to the love of money and the exclusively commercial habits that went with it. In other words, to the species of freedom that has done more than anything else ever invented to lift masses of people out of poverty, and that would later be known as capitalism. America, then, these critics were declaring, was exceptional, all right, exceptionally bad, and even downright evil. Well, on the other hand, there have always been defenders of the belief that American exceptionalism was a vital force for good. Several decades before changing his mind and switching sides, Henry Adams charged the foreign critics of America with blindness to the country's amazing virtues. Whereas, Adams wrote, European philosophers and poets could see only rapacity and vulgarity in America, the poorest European peasants could discern, in Adams's words, that the hard, practical, money-getting American Democrat was in truth living in a world of dream, and was already guiding nature with a kinder and wiser hand than had ever yet been felt in human history. It was this dream, Adams went on to say, that beckoned to the poor of the old world, calling upon them to come and share in the limitless opportunities it offered and that were unimaginable anywhere else. For a long time now, to speak personally, as some of you may know I am notorious for doing, I've taken my stand with the young Adams, to whom America was exceptionally good, against his embittered older self, to whom it had become exceptionally bad. In my own younger days, I was on the left, and from the utopian vantage point to which leftism invariably transports its adherents, it was the flaws in American society, the radical 60s trinity of war, racism, and poverty, that stood out most vividly. It rarely occurred to me or my fellow leftists to ask a simple question. Compared to what was America so bad? After all, from our modern perspective, much more was wrong with Periclean Athens, or the Italy of the Medicis, or England under the first Queen Elizabeth, or 19th century Russia under the Romanovs. But this has not disqualified them from being universally ranked among the very highest points of human civilization and achievement. After more than 40 years of pondering the question, compared to what, I have come to believe with all my heart that the United States of America belongs on that exalted list. We haven't earned a place on it, as the others mainly did, by our contribution to the arts. In this respect, we have never fulfilled the dream of John Adams, who wrote, I must study politics and war that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. You wouldn't have guessed that one in the series, would you? Yet, it's worth pointing out that even in the sphere of the arts, we haven't done too badly. To speak only of literature, names like Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, Edith Wharton, Robert Frost, and many others all attest that we have, in fact, done far better than might generally have been expected of a nation conceived primarily to achieve other ends. These ends were social, political, and economic, and it is in them that we have indeed excelled the most. We have excelled by following our founding fathers, John Adams included, in directing our energies, as our Constitution exhorted us to do, to the preservation of the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, as well as to the pursuit of happiness, tacitly understood by the Declaration of Independence to require prosperity as a necessary precondition. In his original draft of the Declaration, of course, Jefferson used the word property instead of the pursuit of happiness. By remaining, in spite of lapses like affirmative action, faithful in principle and to a considerable extent in practice to the ideas by which the Founding Fathers hoped to accomplish these ends, we and our forebears have fashioned a country in which more liberty and more prosperity are more widely shared than among any other people in the history of the human race. Yes. Yes, even today, when policies unfaithful both to the letter and to the spirit of the traditional American system have resulted in a series of political and economic setbacks. So far as liberty is concerned, until recently, no one but radical libertarians ever argued that we were insufficiently free in these United States. If anything, some conservatives, dismayed by such phenomena as the spread of pornography and sexual license, thought that we had too much freedom for our own good. But thanks to Barack Obama's barely concealed hostility to the free market, his takeover of a greater and greater share of the American economy, and the threat posed by Obamacare to religious and economic freedom, many conservatives are now echoing these libertarian arguments, if in a milder form. Indeed, judging by his record and the many, many things he has said, Obama is not all that concerned about liberty. What he really cares about, and what he assigns a higher value to, is equality. Or, as he once put it, I actually believe in redistribution. Yet here's what the late Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote in 1976 about this very issue in connection with the redistributionist ideology then regnant at the UN and now pervasive in the Obama administration and the political community supporting it. Here's what Moynihan wrote. And equality, what is the record? The record was stated most succinctly by an Israeli socialist who told William F. Buckley, Jr., that those nations which have put liberty ahead of equality have ended up doing better by equality than those with the reverse priority. This is our case. We are of the Liberty Party, and it might surprise us what energies might be released were we to unfurl those banners. 4 years later, Ronald Reagan came along to unfurl those banners, and just as Moynihan predicted, the ultimate result was the release of new political and economic energies that reversed the decline of American political and economic power presided over by Jimmy Carter, and that led to our victory in the Cold War. Of course, the Party of Liberty Moynihan was talking about was the United States of America, and the Party of Equality was the socialist countries of what was then called the Third World. But within America today, an analogous split has opened up, with the Republicans constituting the party of liberty, and the Democrats more and more becoming the party of equality. Hence, the Democrats, led by the president himself, never stop claiming that the rich are failing to pay their fair share of taxes. Yet, after surveying the numbers, the economist Walter Williams of George Mason University asks an excellent question. What standard of fairness dictates that the 10 top percent of income earners pay 71% of the federal income tax burden, while 47% of Americans pay absolutely nothing? To which an editorial in the Wall Street Journal replies, "There is nothing fair about confiscatory tax policy that reduces growth, denies opportunity, and keeps more people in poverty." Then, too, there's the assumption blithely accepted by the party of equality that the gap between rich and poor, or even between the rich and the middle class, self-evidently amounts to a violation of social justice. Yet, far from being self-evident, this assumption stems from a highly questionable concept of social justice, one that rules out or minimizes the role played by talent, character, ambition, initiative, daring, work, and spirit that in reality produce the unequal outcomes of the pursuit of happiness. Okay. Furthermore, both the assumption and the correlative concept of social justice held by the party of equality run counter to the American grain. As study after study has shown, and as the petering out of the Occupy Wall Street movement has recently reconfirmed, what Tocqueville observed on this point in the 1830s remains true today. Americans, unlike Europeans, he said, do not hate the higher classes of society, even if they are not favorably inclined toward them, which is to say that most Americans are not prone to the envy of the rich that eats away at their self-appointed spokesman on the left. Nor are most Americans subject to the accompanying passion for economic egalitarianism that made for the spread of socialism in other countries. What explains the absence of that leveling passion is that it's been starved by the opportunities America has afforded millions upon millions to better their lot and the advantage they have been free to take of those opportunities. And this in turn explains how unprecedented and unmatched levels of prosperity have been created here and how they have come to be shared more widely here than anywhere else. Tocqueville also put his finger on another related reason for the persistence of this particular feature of American exceptionalism that's as striking today as it was at the beginning. The word poor, he wrote, is used here in a relative, not an absolute sense. Poor men in America would often appear rich in comparison with the poor of Europe. Well, a story I was once told by a Soviet dissident who had managed to escape to America provides an amusing illustration. It seems that the Soviet authorities used to encourage the repeated screening of The Grapes of Wrath, a movie, as you may remember, about the migration during the Great Depression of the 1930s of starving farmers in the Dust Bowl who were struggling in their broken-down pickups to reach California. But contrary to expectation, what Soviet audiences got from this film was not an impression of how wretched was the plight of the poor in America. Instead, they came away marveling that in America, even the peasants owned trucks. Tocqueville further observed that in America, and I'm quoting now, the poor, instead of forming the immense majority of the nation, as is always the case in aristocratic communities, are comparatively few in number, and the laws do not bind them together by the ties of irremediable and hereditary penury. Well, as the great economist and social critic Thomas Sowell of the Hoover Institution has demonstrated time and again, it's still the case that the poor in America are comparatively few in number. And except for the black underclass, whose size is generally estimated at somewhere between 2 and 10% of the black community, and whose plight has thus far resisted every attempt at alleviation over the past 50 years, it's also true that penury in the United States is neither irremediable nor hereditary. According to Seoul, of those who live on the next rung of the economic ladder, and a larger number of whom are white than black, only 3% get stuck in the bottom fifth of the income distribution for more than 8 years. Elaborating on Seoul's analyses, Mark Perry of the American Enterprise Institute writes, and I'm quoting here, "In the discussions on income inequality and wage stagnation, we frequently hear about the top 1% or the top 10% or the bottom 99%. And the public has started to believe that those groups operate like closed private clubs that contain the exact same people or households every year. But the empirical evidence tells a much different story of dynamic change in the labor market. People and households move up and down the earnings quintiles throughout their careers and lives. Many of today's low-income households will rise to become tomorrow's high-income households, and some will even eventually be in the top 10% or the top 1%. And many of today's top 1% or top income quintile members are tomorrow's middle or lower class households, reflecting the significant upward and downward mobility in the dynamic U.S. labor market. No such mobility can be found in the members of the European Union, this is me speaking now, or anywhere else for that matter. Even in the dismal economic state our nation has fallen into today, then, it is still exceptional where the degree and the distribution of prosperity are concerned. It would appear, however, that Barack Obama does not agree. When asked whether he believed in American exceptionalism, he took the question to mean whether he believed in the superiority of this country to all others. And to this, he in effect said no. Quote, "I believe in American exceptionalism just as I suspect that the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks, an unfortunate choice, believe in Greek exceptionalism." To which Mitt Romney responded, "Our president doesn't have the same feelings about American exceptionalism that we do." Obama then countered by indignantly denying that he meant what he said about American exceptionalism, as is his wont. Nevertheless, there can be no doubt that a very serious difference about the nature of American society separates Obama from Romney, as it does liberals from conservatives in general. With all exceptions duly noted, I think it's fair to say that what liberals, very much including Obama, mainly see when they look at America is injustice and oppression of every kind crying out for redress. By sharp contrast, conservatives, Mitt Romney most definitely among them, see a complex of traditions and institutions built upon the principles that animated the American Revolution and that have made it possible to say yet again what cannot be said too often, for more freedom and more prosperity to be enjoyed by more of its citizens than in any other society in human history. It follows that what liberals believe needs to be changed or discarded is precisely what conservatives are dedicated to preserving, reinvigorating, and defending against attack from the ideologues on the left who have no great regard for those traditions and institutions and who concentrate their attention on the relatively little that is wrong with America instead of the enormous good embodied within it. A similar divide separates the attitudes of Obama and Romney toward the role America has played in world affairs. Just as Obama denies that he said what he said about American exceptionalism, he also denies that he ever issued the apologies he has clearly issued for the misdeeds of which he imagines we have been guilty in our relations with other countries in general and the Muslim world in particular. Never mind that the United States has been an exceptionally powerful force for good in the world at large. Never mind that we have spilled blood and treasure to liberate and protect many millions of people from the totalitarian horrors, first of Nazism, then of communism, and that since 9/11 we have spilled yet more blood and treasure fighting against Islamo-fascism, the totalitarian successor to Nazism. And as to the Muslim world in particular, Never mind that, as the columnist Mona Charan puts it, of the last 6 wars in which the United States was involved, Kuwait, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, 4 were undertaken to rescue Muslims, and the other 2, Afghanistan and Iraq, had the side benefit of liberating Muslims, and she wisely adds, to what end remains an open question. In spite of all this, the liberal community, with Obama at its head, seems to think that the rest of the world would be better off without us, or, short of that, if we were at least to continue Obama's policy of leading from behind. Admittedly, there are paleo-conservatives like Pat Buchanan and libertarians like Ron Paul who agree on this point with Obama. But Mitt Romney is emphatically not one of them, and neither do most conservatives wish for the radical diminution of American power and influence favored by Obama and his supporters. Shortly before the election of 2008, Obama declared that we were 5 days away from what he described as a fundamental transformation of America. But hard though he has tried, I'll give him that, he has thus far fallen short of fully realizing this ambition. My fervent hope is that on November 6th, the American people will deny him the chance to wipe away as many more traces of American exceptionalism as it will take to turn this country into a facsimile of the social democratic regimes of Western Europe he so deludedly wishes to emulate. My equally fervent matching hope is that the president who succeeds him will keep faith with his promise, in his own words, to restore to this country the principles that made this nation the greatest nation in the history of the earth, and I would add, in my own words, that made it so exceptional, yes, exceptional, a force for good, both at home and abroad. Thank you very much. What a beautiful sound.
In the past 35 years, Hillsdale College has given its Freedom Leadership Award to a few individuals who have distinguished themselves in defense of the good for which the college was founded in its 1844 articles, civil and religious freedom. Among these individuals are William Buckley, Margaret Thatcher, Clarence Thomas, whose wife, my friend Virginia, is here. Stand up. And Edwin Meese III. Now the college is honored to add to their number the illustrious name of Norman Podhoretz. Norman has agreed to answer a few questions.
With all humility, I will try to.
If you have a question, could you please raise your hand, and one of the students with the microphones will come to you, present you the microphone, and then please answer your question. Please ask your question. Thank you.
Driven everybody into silence. There's a.
What exactly was it that led Henry Adams to make the change that he made in his view towards America?
Well, what happened was the radical change that came over the country after the Civil War, when, with the rapid industrialization of the country and then the influx of illiterate immigrants who were needed to supply the labor that the industrialization required, which in turn gave rise to the political machines in the cities. This all seemed just horribly degenerate as compared with the America of the pre-Civil War period, when men of quality and education and taste were running, like his own ancestors, were running the country. He turned 180 degrees in response to these changes, and made exactly the same charges of gross materialism and vulgarity and barbarism that he had so eloquently refuted in the pre-Civil War period.
Mr. Podhoretz, I wonder if you could comment on the lack of time of the President of the United States to meet with the Prime Minister of Israel recently, and American exceptionalism and leadership in the world.
American, what is it?
Exceptionalism.
Yeah, oh, right. Well, I mean, I don't blame the president for not meeting with Bibi Netanyahu. After all, he had to go on David Letterman's show. And so this is only the latest in a series of gestures, symbolic and substantive, that Obama has made since he came into office, with the declared purpose of, how did he once put it, putting some light between us and Israel, on the theory that George W. Bush had been too close to the Israelis, and that this made the peace process, so-called, more difficult to achieve its hoped-for result. And it was also part of of his new conception of the Muslim world in general, which got expressed in this notorious, famous first, but now notorious speech in Cairo, in which he fundamentally apologized for our misdeeds in relation to the Muslim world. And he's done one thing after another consistent with that attitude. I mean, in my judgment, apart from everything else, apart from any ideological considerations, it's an immensely foolish policy, because it's based on a series of assumptions that have been proved over and over and over again to be false. I mean, to put it in the simplest terms, what the problem in the relation between Israel and the Palestinians and the surrounding Arab states is not an equal contest between equally misguided parties, which is what most foreign ministries, including our own State Department, believe. What we have here is a war against Israel that was launched from the minute Israel was born in 1948, and that has continued by various means, hot and cold, ever since. And it is a war with the declared objective, not hidden by, except when it's prudent to do so in diplomatic context, to wipe Israel off the map. Because the feeling is that Israel is an abomination in the eyes of Islam, not supposed to have, this is a territory belonging to Islam in that view, and to have any other sovereignty existing there, especially Jewish sovereignty, is an offense in the eyes of God. In addition to which, Israel is seen by them as an arm of the colonial imperialist powers led by the United States. Now, there's going to be no peace in that part of the world, that is to say, no peace between Israel and I mean, there have been 22 wars, by the way, in the Middle East since the founding of Israel, in which Israel was not involved, although people keep saying that the Israeli conflict with the Palestinians is the main source of instability in the region. It's ridiculous. But there will be peace, if there ever will be, when the Arab Muslim world decides to call off the war that it declared in 1948. I mean, someday this may happen. If it happens, there can be peace the very next day. Until it happens, there is no way there's going to be peace, and Israel will only be forced to make concession after concession, which will make it weaker without bringing peace any closer. Someone said, everyone knows down deep that if the Arabs laid down their arms, there would be peace. And if the Israelis laid down their arms, there would be genocide. And that about sums the position up. So it's an unwise policy, and I mean, if there were more time, I could wax, I would try to wax eloquent on the reasons that this nation should remain committed to not only Israel's survival, but its flourishing. And millions and millions of Americans understand this very well, especially evangelical Protestants who have become more pro-Israel than even the Jewish community. Thank God for that. I mean, I was telling Larry earlier that when I think of the Jewish vote for Obama, 78% in 2008, and apparently climbing again for some inexplicable reason, I paraphrase what Jefferson said about slavery. He said, "I tremble for my nation or my country when I reflect that God is just." I sometimes say I tremble for my people when I reflect that God is just. Not funny, but it's witty, I think.
Our last question, and here we go.
Yeah, okay, I see. Thank you very much for your thoughtful remarks. I have a question about whether there's a significant flaw in the Constitution in this sense, that the passage of Obamacare, which is just the latest in 100 years of progressive imprudence, even if the Republican Party would take the House and Senate in the presidency, because of the extraordinary majority you need in the Senate, and because of the Supreme Court's decision, can you reverse some of these decisions that are made when people start to be given benefits and programs and that sort of thing?
Well, the answer is it'd be very, very difficult, but it's not impossible and it's not unconstitutional. I mean, it's a technical question, basically. I mean, there are some experts who think that you don't need a two-thirds majority in the Senate, that a simple majority would be enough. I don't know whether that's true, but I do know that at least in theory and in principle, it is reversible. In practice, it may be very, very difficult to do, and that would be a calamity. But we can only work toward that goal and hope and pray that it will be accomplished before it half ruins the country. That's a very low note on which to end. So why don't I just say, God bless America.